Well, we are delighted to have General Rawat with us. Of course, he served as Army Chief before his current role, and we all know him as a soldier par excellence, as somebody who has always said the right things at the right time and for the right reason. General Rawat, welcome to this summit. Our topic today is aptly chosen: securing Fortress India. And who better to speak to on this subject than yourself? I just want to begin with something that's been in the news over the last few days. And this is claims that we're losing or we are lost territory in Arunachal, in a particular area, to Chinese who are making villages, etc., and intruding. And a lot of people are saying that we're, again, seeing the kind of situation that we saw in Ladakh, etc., and Galwan. So what really is happening there, and what's your insight?
This issue about Chinese building villages, along the line of actual control is true. But what I wish to come out with is, Chinese are building villages possibly for billeting and locating their civilians or for their military in the future, all along the line of actual control, particularly after the recent face-offs that we've had. But this present controversy that has erupted, that Chinese have come across into our territory and have built a new village, is not true. What the Chinese have done is that they've got posts on their side of the line of actual control, and we've got posts on our side facing each other. Yeah, wherever the Chinese have now developed their posts, we have seen some old dilapidated huts that existed in that area, where mainly, the labor supporting the Chinese state, because Chinese bank a lot of civilian labor for construction of their infrastructure and construction of their, other assets for supplying the soldiers who live on these posts on the LAC. So now some of those huts have been broken and newer infrastructure is being built up. Modern huts are coming up. Yes, maybe a couple of them villages have increased in size. What I would probably feel is that these are to billet maybe the Chinese soldiers. Subsequently, they may also be planning to facilitate arrival of their families once in a while, because they do see at times our civilians going there, our families visiting forward areas at times. So they are watching all this. Now the Chinese soldier is isolated. He comes from mainland China. He's living thousands of miles away from his mainland. And he's seeing our people that, they are in a much happier state. They get to go home much faster. Our soldiers do get, leave to go home from the line of actual control positions at least twice in a year, if not thrice. Chinese soldiers don't have this luxury. So they are building this infrastructure, these kind of so-called villages, which are well within their side of the LAC. They have not transgressed anywhere on our perception of the line of actual control. There are different perceptions. We are very clear where the line of control lies, line of actual control lies, because we have been told that this is your alignment of the line of actual control and this is the territory you are expected to defend. Chinese have a perception which in some areas we know, in some areas we don't know, because they have never really explained where the line of actual control lies according to their perception. But as far as we are concerned, there is no such village development that has taken place on our side of the line of actual control.
So where did this come out of, this entire claim? And of course, there are people who are now saying that, look, we've been there from 1959, etc. We had yesterday a Minister of State for Law, Mr. Kiren Rijiju, coming out and saying that, and he knows the area, of course. So where did this come out of? And
you see, people now have access to satellite images through Google, through various other systems that are operating. So every time a Google image comes out, you see the development that has happened on that side, which was not available to people some years ago. So now with this kind of facility that is available, people start seeing these villages, these huts coming up. They think it is something new. It is becoming new because you were not aware of the existence of such villages earlier. And yes, I would say that earlier these were some kind of thatched huts where the Chinese lived or their graziers lived. but now they have converted them into some kind of a permanent infrastructure. So it gives an impression as if a new village has come up. It is just that old infrastructure is being redeveloped to make it little more comfortable and make it more conducive to the accommodation that they are building for their own soldiers or their civilians alike.
So it's not muscle flexing on their part. It's just a convenience issue. Is that what you're saying?
Certainly not. I wouldn't call it muscle flexing. It is development of the villages. They are trying to make sure that they reach out to their border area, something which we should also be doing. We are also concerned about our border area development, and government has released funds for BADP projects. In fact, we are encouraging people to go up and stay back in their villages because large number of villages along the LAC are being vacated. And why are they being vacated? Because people find job opportunities, education, health infrastructure more in the rural areas. As we now start developing infrastructure, our roads keep coming up. In fact, the first thing that has to happen is development of roads. The moment the roads come up, you will find education, healthcare will happen. Unfortunately, in our case, for so many years, we did not allow road infrastructure to come up because we thought that in case you develop roads, the Chinese will roll down along these roads. I think that was a misnomer. We have realized that if you have to defend your territory, you need to develop infrastructure for the military to hold on to your territory which they are expected to defend.
Let me press you on that point a little bit more with regards to what's actually happening with regards to talks of disengagement, etc. Now, the last round was on October 10th, and there obviously was not any progress because the Indian press release said, and I quote, during the meeting, the Indian side therefore made constructive suggestions for resolving the remaining areas, but the Chinese side was not, unquote. Do give us an update on how things stand now in Ladakh.
Yeah, I think you've raised two issues there. One is disengagement and the next is de-escalation. I will deal with these two issues step by step. Firstly is disengagement. You know that after the confrontation that happened in the Galwan Valley in 2020, the Chinese and Indian soldiers have practically come face to face in a number of areas. Now, remaining in this kind of a disposition is fraught with danger because anywhere you find where troops are in close proximity, it could lead to an ugly situation anytime because of misgivings by either side. So we therefore, first thing we want to do is we want disengagement to happen, and so that the separation of the troops increases. We don't want troops to be in so close proximity. So that has happened in almost all areas. You know what happened in Pangong Tso? The Chinese have fallen back behind finger 8, we've fallen back behind finger 4. So yes, in between there is a moratorium on patrolling, but we will resume patrolling as far as we are able to achieve disengagement in all these sectors. So this is a process. Today there is no area other than, I would say, Nathula, where we've had presence on both sides, where soldiers today are really facing each other in close proximity. So that has been achieved. Yes, we want some more distance to be brought into separation so that the troops that are separating each other are at a greater proximity, because the chances of escalation on both sides rushing again onto the closer proximity of each other can happen. So to avoid that, we are saying that can we now go back to original positions where we earlier were before this escalation happened? Because gradually what happened was when the Chinese came forward, we moved forward. They came further ahead, we moved further ahead. And that is how the proximity situation evolved. Now we have been able to disengage and there has been some separation, but we would be happy to ensure that both people go back to original state, to the original positions which we were occupying prior to April 2020. That is the effort, and that is an ongoing process. To say that there has been a stalemate is because we want both sides to go back to original positions. And at the same time, we want some kind of assurances that these positions will not be reoccupied. Now, you see, this kind of mutual suspicion exists on both sides. So because of the better infrastructure development that has taken place on the Chinese side, we cannot go by equidistant separation. We have to go by equi-time separation. That means if we have to fall back by, let us say, 6 to 8 kilometers, and Chinese also fall back by 6 to 8 kilometers, but they can cover the distance in wheeled transport in about 20 to 25 minutes, and for us it is going to take an hour, then that is not what we call equal separation. We want equal time and distance separation. So on that, there are, some anomalies that keep existing. The Chinese say, why should I go back so far behind? You should be equidistant. We say, no, we have to go by time. They say, let's go by distance. So this is where, some kind of give and take is happening, but finally our effort is to make sure that we follow what we want. We will not budge because we are concerned about Chinese reoccupying these positions. And now that, this thing happened in April 2020, the escalation happened. Now there is suspicion on both sides, and we are now more suspicious because once bitten, twice shy. We are not going to allow our guard down at any time, and we will make sure that we are able to reach out back to our position in a time frame which is faster than the Chinese, certainly not later than them. So that is where in some areas you find that the de-escalation process, disengagement process has been slow. I now come to the de-escalation process. Now, de-escalation process implies both sides have amassed large number of troops on each side of the line of actual control, maybe in some depth areas. Chinese have started building some kind of permanent infrastructure. When you build tunnel defenses, when you build silos for storing your ammunition and weapon systems, these are permanent in nature. So if Chinese are going to stay there permanently, we have to be there permanently. We have also inducted some troops into Ladakh and other forward areas. We are not going to move out from there and will not allow de-escalation till we find that there is some kind of a settlement with the Chinese and they are willing to take back troops and fall back to original situation as existed in April 2020. But as of now, I would say de-escalation appears to be far-fetched because the kind of infrastructure that the Chinese have developed, the kind of infrastructure and induction of troops that we have carried out, it will take a long time to reach status quo. So I think disengagement is likely and will happen, but this kind of de-escalation will take time.
So that's interesting. You're making a distinction between disengagement and de-escalation, and what you're saying is that let's forget about this de-escalation for the time being.
That's right.
So what is the time period then that you're sort of looking at for de-escalation? Is it, let's be a little direct, is it completely off the table now?
No, it is not completely off the table. We are saying that, in fact, we've said, can we do disengagement and de-escalation simultaneously? Well, our thought process is we should not do it simultaneously. First should be disengagement, so that at least the cross proximity positions are taken care of. There is no fear about re-escalation of the situation or coming back to same positions. Once that is resolved, then we can look at de-escalation. To say that, Indian Army cannot maintain troops at this altitude and we will have a problem, well, we have no problem. We maintained them last winter. We are quite capable of maintaining them this winter and in times to come. Government has given up adequate resources to make sure that our troops are comfortable. Our stocking is going on at a very rapid pace. In fact, we've already stocked for the winter for the entire lot. We've got adequate resources to combat the adversary should he indulge in any misadventure. And of course, for our Air Force to induct, it is very easy. In fact, our Air Force can operate from bases which are along the valley floor. So we have a tremendous advantage vis-a-vis our adversary in most of these areas.
So if it comes down to a war of attrition, we're well prepared. That's what you're saying. We're well prepared, and we're not in any hurry to de-escalate either, because we can maintain our forward positions.
Yes, I think, you've heard this from the Chief of the Army Staff, you've heard this from the Chief of the Air Staff, and of course from the Chief of the Naval Staff. We are well prepared for any misadventure by our adversary on the border or in the high seas.
So no other Galwans will happen because we're well prepared to retaliate.
See, Galwan to happen is not in our hands. Whether a Galwan will happen or not is not up to us. It is for the Chinese. Chinese can carry out a Galwan again. But should they carry out a Galwan again, they will get it in the same coin that they got it last time.
General Rawat, what are the friction points that currently still remain unresolved? I mean, I'm just getting into some detail here. Is it Hot Springs, Gogra?
No, we've got some issues in the Depsang plains where we are looking at further de-escalation. That is one area where we find that we need to address. And there is something happening in the CNN Junction area, which is Demchok. So these are the two areas where, there is some kind of situation where troops are still, I would say, in reasonable close proximity. We are not in such proximity that it can lead to suddenly gunfires, shots being fired across. But it could escalate because of the proximity of the troops being closer than in the other areas. These are our major areas of concern.
Let me ask you, General Saab, and this is a question that I want to put to you because it keeps coming up from time to time. And it is obviously an issue that sparks debate also. And it has been said that you're undertaking a very ambitious restructuring of the army, etc., the commands. How key is this Indian military reorganizing itself into integrated theater commands towards securing India, sir?
Well, theater commands have actually become a necessity for our country because, we've got two adversaries with unsettled borders. So you've got to make sure that to deal with the northern adversary, you need a single commander to look at the operational situation there. And he must have the resources from all the three services under command and under his control so that we can find if you can put in a joint effort in an integrated manner to deal with the situation that may evolve on the line of actual control. Similarly, on a western front, again with Pakistan, we need to put up a united joint front. And that can only happen if you have one theater commander looking at one battlefront against one adversary and one theater commander looking at one battlefront against the other adversary. I would like to look at the past, look at the experience that we have gained from our past wars. We fought a war in 1962. In 1962, it was fought by the army on the land. The Air Force was kept out of battle. Why did that happen? It's because the political hierarchy that time felt that the Air Force should not be utilized because if we utilize the Air Force, the adversary China can do more damage to us through their air power. That is because there was possibly a lack of understanding of this integrated joint warfare. And there was no commander, single commander to advise the government on how joint warfare is fought. If at that time we had a joint commander or a unified commander, integrated theater, who could have advised that battle has to be fought on air and land simultaneously. That is why we call it an air-land battle. And had we utilized the Air Force, then the enemy which was rumbling down the hills of Arunachal Pradesh in the Tawang tract could have been dealt, a severe blow could have been dealt to the adversary with the air power. It was not used. It's because we were all working in vertical silos. You look at the 65 operations. The air played a major role, although 65 operation is not much talked about. But our Air Force with a much lesser air combat capability vis-a-vis the Pakis. The Pakistanis had better aircraft vis-a-vis ours. Yet we were able to suppress the Pakistani Air Force on the western front. And finally coming down to the 71 operations. 71 operations, the integrated theater battle and joint employment of forces is seen in Bangladesh, erstwhile East Pakistan and now Bangladesh, where you had an army commander called General Lakhjit Singh Arora, who was actually responsible for the land forces and took control and made the overall plan, along with his Air Force and naval component commanders, who were, Krishnan and Diwan, the two naval and Air Force component commanders. But that time what happened was, the military was told as early as April 71 that something needs to be done to prevent the refugee situation from overflowing into our country and to prevent the terrorist atrocities and the kind of atrocities that were being committed by East Pakistan or the Pakistani army against the population of East Pakistan. So we were given this task as early as April 71. But then, the three chiefs who were there with Manekshaw in the lead, he advised the government that very soon the monsoon will come. We need some time to prepare. And we will decide the time for fighting the war. In the meantime, the Bangladesh Mukti Jodhas, or the Mukti Bahini, they had started dealing with the Pakistan army in East Pakistan and had started weakening them, gathering information about them. So a large amount of intelligence was available to us through the Mukti Jodhas and our own intelligence operatives operating there. So finally, when we decided to go into war in December, because Pakistan initiated the war on the Western Front on 3rd of December, and we went into the war, you found that it was an integrated battle which was fought. The land forces and the air forces were operating in a very joint manner. It was kind of an air-land battle. Both the commanders at some stage decided, if you have to race to Dhaka, then you must do an air-land battle. And we did the Tangel landings. That is when 2 paras were dropped there with the Air Force and the land forces that linked with them, and we were able to reach Dhaka. Navy at the time was told that you must blockade the Chittagong port and make sure that nobody can escape from that side. So what happened there was that the 93,000 prisoners of war booty that we got was because the Navy ensured that no escape route was available from the sea route, otherwise these people would escape. So Navy was doing the task based on the overall plan that had been made. Air Force was supporting the ground forces in the operation. This was a classic example of a theatre battle. And when the battle had been won, the surrender was taken and decided upon by the Eastern Theatre Commander. There was no interference happening from the army headquarters. The 3 chiefs here were advising the government, keeping the government informed what is happening, resourcing the theatre commanders in the way they wanted to be resourced. Now you found that by about 7th or 8th December, when the Pakistani Air Force had been completely decimated in the Eastern Theatre, a decision was taken that some of the Air Force from here could come to the support in the Western Theatre, because we had suffered a setback in Longewala, where the Chinese had launched Pakistanis had launched a very major offensive with their mechanized forces. So the same Air Force was then diverted westward and utilized to blunt the offensive in Longewala. But here again what happened? In the Western Front, you didn't have a theatre battle being fought. You had a Western Army commander operating from Simla, looking at the Western sector, and you had a Southern Army commander operating from Pune, looking at the desert sector. Now, while you were making very good gains in the Western sector, we were almost knocking on the doors of Sialkot and Lahore on the Western sector. But we were suffering some setbacks in the Southern sector in Longewala, and initially in Bhuj also there was some action that had taken place. So what happened was, the resources were diverted. Air Force was decided to Longewala, because it was each, I would say, army commander, calling for assistance, and somebody in Delhi taking a call. Had there been one theatre commander looking after the Western Front, maybe he would have decided, never mind if I lose Longewala, so long as I get Sialkot and Lahore in my pocket, which would have been better. I feel if there had been a theatre commander, the decision to support the operations in Longewala maybe would have gone in favor of pressing on the offensive towards Sialkot and Lahore, which would have been advantageous. And subsequently, we could have still come and maybe, yes, lost Longewala, but recaptured it. So you have to look at, where the value territory lies, where the value objective lies. This can only happen if you have one commander, because here the Southern Army commander thought, oh my God, for me, if I lose Longewala, it's blood on my face. So, I must make sure. So he was crying hoarse to get support, and he was given the support. But then you lost the advantage that you were gaining. You were at Nanakot, knocking the doors of Sialkot, and Sialkot was there for you to take. In the meantime, the ceasefire was called in the eastern sector. So the war had to be called off, and that is where the situation lies today.
Now, time is of the essence, obviously, and I'm speaking with regards to China again. So what is the timeline, very quickly? And my next question, obviously, General Rawat, after you answer that one, is on, again, this new land law that has been promulgated by China for border areas, which came into effect, as you know, on October 23. Now, how does this complicate the resolution of the border standoff? Because what we've seen by the way of statements in Xinhua, which is their, official media outlet, that they are very, very focused on holding on to territory, strengthen their border defense, support economic and social development, as well as opening up border areas. So they're not in any hurry to de-escalate, to borrow from you. So this really messes things up. So first timeline, and then this Chinese challenge.
See, Chinese are reaching out to the border areas which they claim as their territory. So long as they remain themselves confined to their side of the line of actual control, as we perceive it, we have no objection. But if they are going to transgress and come into our side of the territory, then it is a cause for concern. But to come to our side of the line of actual control is not easy, because we are manning practically every region along the line of actual control, and we have got effective means to maintain surveillance. What the Chinese are doing is trying to stake their claim by coming out with historical facts. I think this is something which we should also be doing. What is stopping us from reaching out to our border areas, putting our population in those areas? That is what I said. The first thing that needs to be done is develop the surface infrastructure, which I think is now happening at a rapid pace. If we are able to do that, we should be then able to convince our people that you must stay back in your villages, but for that we will give you good medical care, we will create healthcare facilities, education facilities. And I think if we open these areas for tourism, there is enough scope for adventure tourism in this area which we can open up. So far, we've been very reserved and conservative in allowing our civilians to move to the border. I think as a quid pro quo, we need to do the same thing.
But General Saab, you yourself said that, the LAC is not defined. And the Chinese think that perhaps some of our territory belongs to them, and they have made these claims. Now, the problem with this border law, according to Lieutenant General D.S. Hooda, for example, he says that this law makes China's borders sacred and inviolable. But that is a disadvantage.
See, that's what I said. As of now, we are talking of the line of actual control. If they are going to transgress the line of actual control, if with this they are able to define the line of actual control for us, it is to our advantage. We have been telling the Chinese, can you tell us the alignment of the line of actual control as perceived by you? They have so far not told us. But now by this analogy, if they are going to actually define the line of actual control and say, this is my border, I think it should work to our advantage. But if they are going to say the line of actual control transgresses the so-called line of actual control, which we have laid down and defined for ourselves, then it's a cause of concern and we will not allow that to happen. We are ensuring that we maintain regular surveillance in these areas. If you think the Chinese can
so
just
are you
walk
saying,
in,
sir, that at some point, because look, when a law is promulgated in China, and this is what people are saying, it is not an open democracy where, you'll have clamor from public to reappeal laws, you'll have courts that might look into it. They will make their claim and they will say, we will, as some people have said, like General Hooda, that this is now sacred and inviolable. Sorry, take it or leave it. What are we going to do? Is conflict inevitable?
Okay. What has our government said in Parliament about our territory? Therefore, we are saying that is sacred. We have said Jammu and Kashmir state completely belongs to us. It has been quoted in Parliament. So we have already defined a boundary. We have defined what Chinese are saying is something after we have said. We have defined a boundary that as far as Ladakh is concerned, this is our claim line, this is our border, or this is the territory that belongs to us. So if that be so, then is it that we have defined our borders and we have said this is our borders? If he is going to now have overlapping claim lines, then of course there will be contestation.
But so there will be contestation.
Yes, there will be contestation if there are going to be overlapping claims on borders. That's why I said, if he is going to transgress across our line of actual control, then obviously it's a case for contestation.
So are we headed for a period of greater contestations with China on territorial issues?
You are falling into the psychological trap that China always plays. China is a great master at psychological warfare. And if you get cowed down with the psychological warfare, you will lose the war. You have to always stay ahead of his times, understand the game of psychology and deception that the Chinaman keeps playing and stay well ahead of him. Don't get cowed down by statements that he keeps making and laws that he keeps coming out with. He can make a law for himself. That law is not binding on me. I have to make sure that I defend the territory which we have been asked to defend at all costs. That's what we will do.
Who poses the greatest threat, in your assessment right now, to Fortress India, to India's national sovereignty, sir?
Obviously, the northern neighbor, China.
So it is the enemy number one, you would say?
You should have no doubt in that. I think everybody has said so, that we for too long focused on our Western adversary, whereas, very many years ago, our government has been saying your major threat lies in the north. I mean, we are well aware of that, and therefore the complete focus over the years has been shifting. We created additional forces for the northern theatre. We have created a mountain strike corps. After all, this is something that not only us, very many years ago, people realized that the threat is emerging on the northern borders.
Well, the Chinese are also, of course, deepening their engagement with Pakistan. And the Pakistanis obviously did not come for this particular meeting that the NSA had just yesterday on Afghanistan, which is another area of concern now. The Chinese, as you know, stayed away. They're meeting today, the two of them, with the US representative across the border. This clearly tells you that they're working in tandem now. And I want to ask you, sir, what should India be doing with regards to Afghanistan? Our concern is if the Chinese get in there, the Pakistanis get in there, there'll be strategic depth, and that'll give them greater strategic autonomy to do things against India. There's a big debate about whether we should engage the Taliban, diplomatically recognize them, or let them stew for a little while and open a direct sort of, contact with the Afghani people, give them relief directly, ignore the Taliban. What is it that you recommend?
Don't you think what happened yesterday has been a complete game changer in this entire game on Afghanistan? You've got the NSAs of all the northern neighbors of Afghanistan in India talking together in one language, one voice, including Iran. So if this kind of a masterstroke has been played by our government, I think it has completely upset the apple cart that the Afghans with the Chinese and the Taliban, I would say, in Afghanistan, with the Chinese and Pakistanis were playing. I think they have seen the kind of mechanism that India has adopted to bring back its stake in Afghanistan. I think this has been a masterstroke by our government.
At the same time, let me ask you, given the fact that the Haqqanis now obviously are part of this regime, and we know that the Haqqani network has been long nursed by Pakistan, are we now seeing a situation, General Rawat, where there is going to be an escalation of some sort of cross-border terror attacks? Because these are all assets of the Pakistani military, and they played such a big role in installing the Taliban. Are we going to see a period now of some amount of conflict across the LAC in Kashmir?
Well, we have numerous internal security challenges in our country. There are a large number of insurgent and terrorist groups which are operating. This will add yet another dimension to the terrorist threat that is looming large on our borders. To say that some of the Lashkar-e-Toiba or the Jaish-e-Mohammed terrorists who have been associated with the Pakistan Taliban are not going to infiltrate into India would be far-fetched. They certainly will, and they will come with some sophisticated weapons and other systems. We have dealt with this situation earlier, and we will continue to deal with this situation. We are prepared for the countering this kind of infiltration. If they find other means of reaching our country, we will deal with them. It is not the first time we are dealing with Afghans or other foreign nationals operating in the Kashmir Valley. They have operated earlier. You see, today what is happening in Kashmir is that there is a kind of frustration that is setting in amongst the militant ranks. That's why you find they are changing strategy. They have now started getting after the locals, maybe locals of a different community. But there is anger brewing amongst the people. If you have to, for any terrorist or an insurgent organization to succeed, it needs support of the local people. The moment you wean the local people away from you, which the security forces have been successful, and the terrorists are, I think, doing a great blunder by what they are doing. Ultimately, in the long term, they will lose this battle they are trying to fight. You cannot fight insurgency and terrorism without the support of the local population, and that is where I think we should look at the positive side of what is happening, but at the same time, we have to control what these people are trying to do. We cannot allow exodus of other communities from Kashmir. We cannot allow killing of the same community or people whom the terrorists feel are, security forces informers. You start killing them, ultimately it will work to your disadvantage.
But General Rawat, the targeted attacks seem to suggest that they're based on identity. And you yourself have sort of talked about this Cynic Islamic alliance that is taking root and how it's going to pose a threat to the free world democracies, especially countries like India and others in the West. Now, before I come to that question, I just want to ask you, I was reading reports yesterday that certain Kashmiri Hindu families that had been targeted, especially government servants' families that fear that they might be next, had left the valley, and they were issued some kind of notices by the state government. Do you think this is right? I mean, why victimize them again and again?
No, I think, it has been played out of proportion. We saw a large number of videos and statements coming out that there has been mass exodus from the valley. There has been no such exodus. Very few people have left. In fact, let me tell you, how does the terrorist organization function? It functions through a lot of false information that they keep
But sir, some of these people on record to say that we don't want to live there. I mean, you might have read the papers this morning, and yesterday Times Now was reporting that relatives of Mr. Bindru who were recently targeted, they're saying we don't want to live here anymore. So this is a reality. These people have found, the press point, the press button or whatever you want to call it, and they are pressing that button.
You see, one odd family gets targeted, yes, other members of the family do feel threatened and will show a tendency, if you got a safer haven outside Kashmir Valley, they would like to leave. But what we are talking of, targeted killings and exodus happening, every time the apple season gets over, a large number of labor moves out of the valley. This happens every year. So this year, if some people are going out, it is the apple season is over. Apple has been plucked. And now that labor is returning back. They come back again in March, April, when the season again. In the winter months, no outside labor wants to stay in Kashmir, except for a few who are working on, as local household support.
No, but sir, that's fine. I take your point. But should these people be show-caused by the state administration?
See, they have been show-caused not because of that. They have been show-caused to say, we can provide you safer haven if you are willing to come into safer havens. And therefore, the state government is actually providing them safer haven that if you feel threatened, rather than carrying out an exodus that happened earlier, don't do that. You come to us, we can provide you safer havens. And that is what we are looking at. In fact, we as security forces have offered to the local population that anybody who feels threatened, please come to us. We will provide you temporary shelter.
Instead of using this officious sort of, sending a notice, etc., you could have made a general appeal. It could have been handled better. More sensitively?
See, I still won't say it could have been handled better. It has been handled reasonably well. What they are trying to say is, if you feel threatened and you have alternate method of living, but don't leave your base here. What we are saying is, like earlier what happened was, people left their bases and left, and which was taken over by the Kashmiri terrorists there. Now, we don't want that to happen. But if somebody feels, yes, I've got a safer haven in Delhi, I've got some place in Jammu and I want to move there temporarily, move. But others who have no place to go, don't take that call. You come to us, we will protect you. It's a temporary phenomena. We will get over this problem and we will be able to deal with the situation.
Are we doing a good job of protecting them?
Yes, we can protect them and we are caring for them.
We've had so many attacks.
You see, you had about, 11 to 12 attacks have happened. But these are something, that's what I'm trying to say. What is the adversary trying to do? You don't play into the adversary's head. Adversary wants a mass exodus. You have to make sure that you do not play into this game. He wants you to carry out an exodus. Our aim is to prevent this exodus. Otherwise, you're playing, he does 11, 12 killings and the exodus starts. This is something which we have to prevent. And how are we preventing it? That every terror attack that is happening, anybody who's carrying out the attack, I think within 48 hours to 72 hours, is being eliminated or apprehended. Nobody has been allowed to go scot-free. So the terrorists themselves will soon realize that you are getting caught. Because and how are you getting caught? Obviously, it is local support. Who's giving you the information? The locals. The same locals are giving you information about the terrorists. And in fact, now what we are told is that the locals are saying we'll lynch the terrorists, which is a very positive sign that is coming in. Locals are saying now we'll start lynching the terrorists.
Where does this come out, General Saab?
There is, if you go to the social media, there are now statements coming out that the locals are saying that if you want, we will now start lynching these terrorists because we will not allow this to happen.
So you're saying that the locals are saying that they're going to lynch the terrorists where? When they come into their homes or into their...
No, you see, so far what's been happening is a large number of these locals know where these terrorists are. They know where they are operating. It's the fear of the gun that keeps them, disclosing the information. But now they are coming out with a different analogy to say, either we will lynch them or we'll make arrangement that they get lynched. We will not allow this kind of a thing happen. So this is not something that is being appreciated by the locals. Now, whether this is a message for the terrorists to say that you do this, you will get lynched, and therefore you should not do this. Now, whether it is being played up by the intelligence agencies, I would even then say this is a good card being played. So they that we'll lynch you.
So to say that locals will lynch terrorists, you think is a good card?
I think it's a good card being played. Why? Because you must put the same fear in the mind of the terrorists. Before you lynch me, I'll lynch you.
But of course, there'll be a whole lobby of human rights activists who will say that you're encouraging this sort of vigilantism.
Hold on, I have said lynching a terrorist, you're calling it as, human right violation. If there's a terrorist operating in your area, why should you not lynch him? You should allow him. You should allow. It is like I will quote an example. I will now quote an example.
No, 1 second, General Saab. This is an important point you're making. So you're saying that if there is a terrorist, what's the harm in lynching that terrorist? Now, half the problem is that there are politicians, mainstream politicians in Kashmir who say that the Indian army kills people who they think are terrorists, but actually not terrorists, they're innocent Kashmiris. How do you know someone is a terrorist, and does this give license to the army then to knock off people and claim that they are terrorists, and then they say they were lynched? I'm just saying.
No. What I'm saying is, we are lynching a terrorist. To be identified as a terrorist, he has to be a human being with a weapon. So I am saying that if he is going to carry out an act of terror on somebody, obviously he's doing it with a weapon. Unless he's going to the knife and he's going to slit the throat, which is hidden somewhere, a different issue. So therefore, if he's carrying a weapon, is likely to carry out an attack. And before that, if I can lynch him, where is the problem? I'll give you an example now. You know, in Sopur, when I was a commander, there used to be convoys passing through, and the intelligence people would tell us that there's likely to be a grenade attack on the convoy. So we would put people in civilian clothes, some intelligence operatives to keep a watch on people. Now you found a chap who's got a grenade in his hand, he's hiding behind his pocket, and he's waiting for the convoy to come. If I lynch him, if I catch him at that time, he goes into a fight with me, and in that fight he takes out his weapon and he threatens me, but before that I fire at him and I kill him. Now the issue is, I have killed an innocent. So what if he had a grenade in his hand? But after he has lobbed the grenade on the vehicle and caused injuries to 2 of my people, now I can kill him, because now he's a terrorist. With a grenade in hand, intelligence operator was telling me that there is likely to be a grenade attack. I have seen the grenade in his hand. I have lynched him. But in that lynching bargain that is going on, a firefight ensues and he dies. Have I committed a blunder, or have I committed a murder?
So you're saying you're acting in self-defense? Now,
Yes, I would say, as per the human rights activists, yes, I have committed a murder. But according to my military knowledge, no.
But sir, doesn't this give a license to... 1 second, sir. 1 second. Doesn't this give a license to people, perhaps even in the intelligence services, to go out and kill Kashmiris and then say that, look, the man was a terrorist, he was lynched? How do you verify?
The 11 people or 12 people who have been attacked have no human rights. You are allowing the terrorist to commit human right violation and are allowing him to go scot-free. But for a security force personnel or a local civilian who says, I have nabbed that terrorist and I have lynched him, becomes a perpetrator of human rights. I haven't understood this logic.
So I'll tell you why. Because you were army commander at a time when you were the army chief. There was an officer called Mr. Gogoi, and there was an action that he took. And you remember what happened after that. There was a huge hue and cry. And many people said that this is also a form of vigilantism. You are taking a human shield. So I'm just saying, it is already a fraught environment where there is very little trust. And we're adding now another dimension. So that's the only reason I'm pressing on and trying to understand, so that, you know, our audience can see where you're trying to draw the line and make that distinction. My question is, who makes that distinction on behalf of the people?
The people who have been tasked to counter terrorism make that decision. You have been given a task.
But you're talking about civilians, sir.
No,
you're not talking about the counterinsurgency.
What I'm trying to say
forces.
is, you have quoted the example of Major Gogoi.
Yeah.
If Gogoi was tasked to extricate people who had gone for electioneering, it was late evening, and he had to pull out those people because now they were getting threatened by the locals there, amongst whom were also terrorists carrying weapons. And he was asked to secure the election party along with some of the ITBP people who had weapons, and they felt we are going to be overwhelmed. So they wanted support, and Major Gogoi goes there. If you could have found a better solution, the better solution would have been, Gogoi should have loaded them in this vehicle. Anybody obstructing his path, fired at the legs, injured 6-7 people, maimed them, and come out. That was also a solution. Do you think that was a better solution? If you feel that is a better solution, and because you're allowed to fire below the legs, so you fire and say, anybody who's coming at me, I'm firing at the legs, below the knees, and you maim 7-8 people, but you extricate the people. Yes, he did commit some kind of a so-called human right violation as the people perceive. According to us, at that spur of the moment, in his own wisdom, he felt this was the best way of extricating people. You can call him a human shield. He says, I have utilized one person to ensure the security of large number of other people and not caused mayhem in the area.
But sir, this is
because
Major
4 or 5
Gogoi.
rounds being fired and somebody being injured could have led to retaliatory action and then counter-retaliatory action. And we don't know.
No,
Just
true.
because that did not happen, today we are talking this language. What if it happened that he had fired and injured one people and they had retaliated and he had counter-retaliated and that would have led to a massacre?
So we are speaking in the context of a specific decision taken by an army officer. But we are not talking about that when you are suggesting that there are civilians now, and you think that this is advantageous, who are saying that we are going to lynch terrorists. That will be a decision that will not be taken by any trained army officer. It will be taken by members of civil society. And they will just go out there and lynch people who they will say could be terrorists or may not be terrorists. Who at that moment is going to determine if that was a terrorist or not? That's the question I want to ask.
Now I'll tell you, even in other communities outside Jammu and Kashmir, you have a lot of theft that happens, murders that happen. You find local communities then get together, so we'll do our own local policing along with the civil police. So what happens is they put their own, it happens a lot in villages. If you live in villages, you'll find that a lot of local policing happens because, there are groups that come from other villages to steal cattle. Now, when cattle stealing happens and they find that every day cattle are being stolen, the village community is formed and they say, okay, we will defend ourselves. So people sit down with lathis and say, okay, we will defend ourselves at night. We will sit on guard here, here and here and make sure that our cattle are not stolen. And when the cattle stealers comes, at time, the lathi drill happens. And in that lathi drill, if a civilian dies who's come to steal the cattle, yes, the law takes its own course. But then the law is aware of, under the situation that this happened, is it a human right violation or not? Something that the courts will decide. But the court, when it understands the whole thing, that this has happened under these conditions, I think takes a call based on the situation. This happens everywhere. Why are you only singling out Jammu and Kashmir? People do self-defense everywhere. Self-defense volunteer forces have been created in most villages in our country. It happens in the northeast a lot, where again you have insurgent groups who come for taxation, who come house to house collecting taxes. There are self-defense forces which have been created by the village communities. It's a very common thing in our country.
So let me ask you, you would admit that there might be room here for abuse of this process. Would you at least
You are
admit
calling it abuse. I am not calling it abuse. I am saying when a terrorist has started committing abuse, I am countering it.
Okay.
I am not, you are not calling the other side abuse. I am saying the terrorist here has started perpetrating fear and has actually executed people. People have been killed. Now here in self-defense also people can do nothing. This is an act of self-defense. Today somebody is saying they are going to come to my village. I don't know whom they will kill next. It could be me. So here is the community which says we will defend ourselves on our own, and you are calling it.
Right. I'm not. I'm apprehending what people might say.
I have clarified it. I am saying This is self-defense. Every man has a right to self-defense in our constitution and according to the law.
Let's talk along those lines. Obviously, all of this is happening, these targeted killings, and they're identity-based. There's no point now denying it. Now, in that context, sir, this seems to suggest that there are two ideologies that are grating against each other, and you've talked about this Cynic Islamic alliance that is also taking root. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, I am only looking at some theses that somebody has propagated. And I was talking about Samuel P. Huntington, who wrote a thesis in Clash of Civilization, where he said there could be a clash of civilizations. So I said, and he said the clash of civilizations will happen along fault lines. And one of the fault lines he identified was the area of Persia. Now Iraq and Afghanistan, this is the belt they talked about. So is it likely to happen, or is it already happening? We may say, we don't believe in the clash of civilizations, fine. But are you very sure the other countries don't believe in the clash of civilizations and clash of civilizations will not happen? It's something which we have to wait and watch. Will it happen or not? I mean, we've seen empires coming because of clash of civilization. There has been an Ottoman Empire. There was a caliphate. There are people who are saying we want to revive the caliphate. What is the revival of the caliphate? It is clash of civilizations. It will lead to clash of civilization if the caliphate is to be revived.
So I just want to ask you, General Saab, because the EM, Mr. Jaishankar, said that India has never believed in the clash of civilizations. Has India never believed in the clash of civilizations? Do you agree with him?
Well, we have been a very tolerant nation. Anybody who has entered our nation, we have welcomed them. And today we are in that situation where we've lived with all the communities. But clash of civilizations happens when you start throwing out people. I would say a clash of civilization in a very, in a very minor term happened in Kashmir.
And it is majorly happening in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, where
that
minorities are being targeted and kicked out.
I would even refer to that as a clash of civilization.
So would you then go on to say that perhaps the CAA, the law, the law is a reaction to this clash of civilizations, this clash of ideologies?
Yes.
Would you say that the CAA has also been drawn up to mitigate against this?
No, CAA has been drawn up to amalgamate and make it one country. We say we are one nation, one flag.
So these are the victims of the clash of civilizations.
So that is all part of making sure that we become, we are a very tolerant community.
Right.
We believe in amalgamating all societies, all communities, all religious denominations under one flag, one umbrella, one constitution. That is what we are looking at.
A couple of questions before I open this up to the audience. Give me 2 minutes. Just a couple of questions on Quad and AUKUS. How do you see AUKUS, General?
Well, AUKUS has got some military connotations. Quad has none of those. Quad is something which has got more to do with Sagar. You know, when we look at security and growth for all in the region, that is what Quad is all about. We are looking at making sure that in this particular region, there are 4 democratically elected governments which have come together to mitigate the problems of everybody else in the region, especially when you face HADR. Now you have this pandemic, these things will continue to occur. So there are nations who are haves and the have-nots. It is between the haves trying to support the have-nots to make sure that there is equal security and growth for everybody. AUKUS is a completely different issue. AUKUS is giving, you know, some kind of a military power to one nation, that is Australia, for them to operate. So you can't compare these two at all.
But do you believe that the Quad needs to equip itself militarily also at some level to counter Chinese aggression?
I think presently the way we are working with Quad is working absolutely fine. Alongside Quad, but very different from that, we are carrying out joint exercises with a number of nations, some of which are members of the Quad, some outside the members of the Quad.
So the formation of the Quad doesn't preclude military cooperation, that's what you're saying?
No, I don't say that. I am saying that military cooperation is happening with nations even beyond the Quad. We've just had HMS Elizabeth from England, you know, UK, participating in a joint exercise with us. It is not member of the Quad. So to confine this only to Quad would be incorrect. Exercises and whatever role we are playing with the other armed forces is a very different issue. Quad has a completely different connotation and different purpose.
Let's open this up. Thank you, General Saab. Let's open this up. Some questions. Mihir wants to ask a question.
Sir, the theme for this summit is actually, celebrating India at 75 and shaping India at 100. So we are talking about next 2-3 decades and how India should evolve in all aspects, including military and defense. So in next 20-30 years, what are going to be the key critical steps that India must take to, one, ensure a scenario where we might be fighting war on 2 borders, that is China and Pakistan, and second is the evolving equation between US and China, India and Russia, and India and US?
Yeah, we have to be prepared for the future. And future, best way is to avoid contestation. We would like to avoid a contest with either of the adversary, leave alone a 2-side war. But that can only happen if you have credible deterrence. And that is what we have to create. How does deterrence work? Deterrence works if you have a political intent which is very clear, and you have a military power which is capable of executing operations if they are thrust upon us. So the moment your adversary knows that your intent, the political intent is very clear, and that this country is capable of taking offensive action, and they have the military might to deal with you militarily, that will serve as a deterrence. There is unlikely to be war. Therefore, if your political intent remains strong and is spelled out very clearly, and you maintain a strong military balance, you will deter wars. So our aim would be to deter war first by maintaining this kind of analogy with both the political and the military leadership. So therefore, I am saying we would like to deter war on both fronts, leave alone individually, but deter war on both fronts. If it is thrust upon us, we are prepared. Now, when you look at the future and how we are going to develop with India, America, India, China, Russia, China, India, Russia, I would say, we have to maintain our strategic autonomy. We want to work with the US because we feel that to become self-reliant and make sure that our armed forces become self-reliant, because we have been for far too long import dependent on our weapons and other systems, we need technology. And technology today is available with the West. At the same time, we cannot shy away from dealing with Russia because a large amount of our equipment comes from there. We cannot just throw away this equipment. So our dependence on Russia will remain because the spare parts for this equipment will continue coming from there. Some of the equipment that we are presently operating is compatible only with Russian equipment. So therefore, we will have to continue banking on Russia if we have to keep your current inventory going, because the comparative with future equipment is only with those equipment. When you buy Western technology, it cannot operate with Russian technology because they will always debar you from sharing, the common waveforms, common algorithms. So therefore, since we have an inventory from Russia, we have to maintain a relationship from both. I'm talking at the military level. Now, if you look at the political level, I think we have a good relationship, working relationship with America. At the same time, we have a good relationship working with Russia. Why should we lose out on that? If we can work with both simultaneously, it is to our advantage, and we should continue to do so. As far as Russia and China is concerned, our effort should be to make sure that we are able to deal with Russia in such a manner that Russia and China together do not pose a threat to us. And to that extent, that's why I'm trying to say, so long as you maintain a political and a military balance with Russia, you will be able to wean them away from China in case a confrontation happens between China and India. So I think the balancing of forces in the future for us, we have to ensure that we do it very well at the political level. Our engagement at the political level with both Western and with America and Russia must continue. At the military level, we must continue with our engagement. And diplomatically, of course, we are dealing well with the entire region. In fact, I think worldwide, we have now put our diplomatic stamp everywhere in a very positive manner.
The gentleman in the red jumper, yes. Identify yourself, sir.
Yeah, my name is Dr. Sarjeet Dudeja. Sir, we have been talking about traditional way of war, but recently we have seen COVID-19. It's a biological war, almost. And Trump was very much adamant about take action against China, and Merkel was also quite open. But why not to take some Indian side to take such a action? Are we really prepared to deal this type of biological war? We have lost so many thousands of people, millions of dollars.
So your question is, are we prepared to deal with biological warfare?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. General, sir.
We are saying warfare is constantly evolving. So anybody who plays this card of biological warfare has to also be wary of protecting his own people from that warfare, which means he will have to first come out with a vaccine, vaccinate his people against that, and that will give you enough warning to say that some kind of biological warfare is likely to be perpetrated by the adversary. So yes, you have to be prepared for it. Should it be used as a weapon? I don't think so. It should be used as a weapon. It is not a good weapon to use because it will affect humanity as a whole. It will not just affect one particular nation. It will transcend borders, especially in the neighborhood.
Okay, gentleman in the coat. One sec. Sorry, I didn't see you. Okay. So after that, you can go. Yes, sir.
Sir, I'm Siddharth Talia from Times Now. Sir, the issue here is about the very fact that civilians are not necessarily infallible. Neither are the security forces, neither is the judiciary of this country, neither is the press, and neither are our intelligence apparatus. So, therefore, in that context, when we have a situation where one might take law into their own hands without necessarily having been able to independently establish the antecedents of the adversary, or in this particular context, terrorists. Doesn't that therefore end up exposing us to the possibility of large-scale abuse, particularly with regards to lynchings of people that we might perceive to be terrorists? There have been lynchings across the country over WhatsApp rumors, over child kidnapping, and these have been proven to be false, and yet people have been lynched. So therefore, does this situation not expose us to large-scale abuse, human rights abuse, when lynchings are necessarily rationalized?
See, you have used the word terrorist, which means you have already identified the person as a terrorist. You are now, I think, you need to be very clear on you are dealing with a normal human being, a citizen, a genuine law-abiding citizen of the country, or a terrorist. If you have identified a terrorist, then he's a terrorist. You got to deal with him as a terrorist. So if a terrorist is there to perpetrate crime, and he has been committed crime, and he has decided to take up the weapon or the gun against the state, against the law of the land, what do you deal with him? How do you deal with him? So therefore, differentiate very clearly between a law-abiding citizen and a terrorist. And therefore, when you are comparing lynchings in other part of the country and against a terrorist, these are two different things. I think a terrorist has to be dealt with in a different manner vis-a-vis a normal civilian who is not a terrorist, not even an insurgent.
Okay.
So I think that difference lies. If you have identified him as a terrorist, he's a terrorist.
Sir, please identify yourself.
Hello, my name is Nalin Savara, and I have a question for General Rawat. Sir, I mean, you mentioned the idea of lynching, and you drew a parallel between that and lynchings around cattle stealing. So, as I understand it, in Jammu and Kashmir for a long time, there have been village defense committees which have been backed by the military, by local military units and military commanders. And in the past, those village defense committees have been armed, etc. So, as I understand it, if you are encouraging lynching, then in this case, it's not the military which will be backing the people who are doing the lynching, but it will be the judicial mechanism.
Okay.
And I'll say one more thing to complete my question, that in situations like the lynching of Pehlu Khan, where an innocent man who had bought cows was lynched, and after being accused of being a potential beef trader and all, in that case, the local civil administration supported the people who lynched him, because years have passed and hearings have come to a naught.
Okay,
so the implication of what you just said, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, or you can give your point of view, is that you will encourage such a regime in place of the existing village defense committees that use military support and weapons.
So just a quick response to this gentleman, because I think it's the same question.
Can you tell me one thing?
Mike.
Does lynching always lead to killing? I think, we need to be very clear in what the words we are using. Does lynching always lead to a kill, or lynching can also lead to an apprehension?
So lynching, by definition, involves a lynch mob and a person who is either hanged by the mob or burnt or beaten up to death by the mob. That is the dictionary definition of the word lynch.
Does it have to lead to death?
So that the definition of the word means this. So just like the definition of assassination means kill rather than assassination attempt, that's the definition of the word.
This was the same question, sir, that the previous
no, that's not the same question.
No, you are no, I'll answer this.
Can we...
What he's done is,
others also.
You are comparing apples and oranges. As I said, on the one hand, you are saying a terrorist is an identified. The moment you have used the word terrorist, you have identified him as a terrorist.
So you could share your point of view about
I think he's already gone into the details.
My point of view is very clear that
let's take the mic over. Mr. Take the mic over. Thank you very much. Hand it to the gentleman here.
You are comparing two different analogies. Lynching of an innocent and lynching of a terrorist, what I said. Lynching of a terrorist is a different issue. Lynching of an innocent civilian is a different issue.
Okay. Yes.
I have a question about what is happening in Poonch. It's been close to a month now. We've lost 9 soldiers, including 2 JCOs, and there hasn't been a single terrorist that we've managed to either flush out or kill. What is the problem there? In fact, now there are even apprehensions that they may have escaped from Poonch into Shopian. So I have 2 questions about this. One, what is the problem? Why did we not manage to catch those people who've killed 9 of us? And second, could these be people, because there was apprehension earlier, that a lot of the fighters from Afghanistan could now be sent into India? more specifically Kashmir. Could these people be one of those fighters, which is why they have managed to last so long?
See, we have information about 2 groups of terrorists having infiltrated through the Poonch, Minder sectors. We have definite information of this. Out of these 2 groups who infiltrated, 6 to 7 people have been eliminated in the area of Poonch itself and in Minder areas. They have been eliminated. There are still 4 to 5 people who are lurking in this area. Now, some of these have taken shelter in the forested areas of where this operation is going on. They have got hideouts in this area. They got into this. Now, conducting operation in deep jungles is not an easy task. And therefore, what happened is we have gone in and surrounded these people and tried to conduct operations and entered the jungle. The issue is that, after the monsoons, when the grass grows big, your method of operating in the jungles has to be different from the way you operate in built-up areas. Unfortunately, what's happened is we have got so used to now operating in built-up areas of Shopian and Pulwama that we have started applying similar tactics to jungle operations. I feel the method of operating in this particular area should have been different. You can avoid entering a jungle. We have done it a number of times, but maybe people were so excited about, getting these terrorists because they had definitive information that they've possibly been led into a trap. And that is where, some kind of mistakes have been committed by troops. But these 3 to 4 terrorists who are operating in the area are still at large, and the security forces operations are ongoing, not in that particular forest area, because now what we've done is we've get out that forest area and we are waiting if they to tire them out. If they come out, we'll get them. So we have moved out to other areas to conduct the operations to make sure that they do not conduct any such terrorist atrocities against the civilian or the local population in other areas.
Okay, last 2 questions because your ADCs are.
But they have certainly not reached Shopian and Pulwama.
Sir, RSN Singh, two quick questions. One was before Trump relinquished office. He got passed a very important bill, Tibet Support Bill, Tibet Support Policy Bill. It was a bipartisan, it had bipartisan support. Now, 2-3 things it says. One is that it says that, there will not be, Americans will not allow any fresh consulate to be established unless American consulate is allowed in Tibet. And the second was that only the successor chosen by Dalai Lama will be acceptable to them. Now, I know it is in the realm of, Ministry of External Affairs, but nevertheless, I mean, it's we who should have done this. We should have closed down your consulate in Calcutta, in Kolkata, unless you allow us a consulate in Tibet. And the same Dalai Lama is here. He's not in America. The second question, sir, you talked about exodus. Yes, I take your words. Maybe this time it is exaggerated. But, sir, what happened in 91? Let me tell you, sir, that it was not that there was any dearth of security forces, sir. They were paralyzed. So don't you think there is a need to make the forces, the local forces, more autonomous in their decision making to ensure that 91 doesn't happen again, sir? There was a core sitting there, sir. And I mean, you often talk about third front. Sir, countries have collapsed because of third front. And this 91 was a typical example. The editor, sir, Rahul Shivshankar, he is a victim of that 91, this thing. With so many security forces. I mean, why this paralysis? Why, sir, you must permit them to take autonomous decisions, sir. They're very senior commanders, and I'm sure they must have been, selected after a lot of, thank you.
Response. Yes, sir.
First what you said, what the US has done to Tibet, should we have done it? Well, that's a decision that the government has to take. You rightly said it's an MEA thing. But I would say we should look at the broader picture. If we are to open, let us say, a consulate in Tibet, and if we start issuing visas to Tibetans, and the Chinese don't let them leave Tibet or come to India, what is the purpose of that visa? Your visa becomes, insignificant then. So you have to look at that. If you are going to open that consulate, then you must have the authority to make sure that your visa gets respected. But if it is going to be denied, is it worth taking a challenge which you cannot then push through? Then you get egg on your face. So, you have to you have to weigh the pros and cons. Let us say, if Americans have said, okay, we will open a consulate there, and the Chinese, and they issue a visa to Tibetans, but the Chinese don't allow those people to leave their country, then what happens? Your visa becomes zero. Your visa loses its value. Then you will have to take some kind of action against the government which is not permitting your visa to be utilized properly. So, and to say that how Dalai Lama will be selected and all that, that is something which the government is taking. Chinese feel differently, we feel differently. We will see who finally wins. It is finally Dalai Lama who has to take a call. He will take a call in the best wisdom for his own countrymen, for his own people, his own Tibetans. And I'm sure he will not take a decision which does not favor the people of his origin. That we are quite confident of. And your second question is about giving autonomy to the local commanders. Autonomy has been given. I mean, when you are operating in an insurgent environment where you don't know who your adversary is, if you do not give autonomy to the people, the commanders, and even to the soldiers on ground, the NCOs who are leading independent patrols, they have to have autonomy, because they cannot look behind their back for orders in a situation where you don't know where the enemy is. Enemy could be walking with you and suddenly take out a pistol and point it at you. He could be walking with you. So therefore, autonomy has been given to the local commanders, and let me tell you, the kind of freedom of action that our own defense minister has given us is amazing. He's one person who said, you take action, I will stand behind you, provided the action has been taken not in personal interest, but in the overall interest of the community. He has promised that he will stand behind us.
Sir, last question. Yes.
Sir, good evening. My name is Ashal Yadav, and sir, I have an easier question for you. Sir, now I have been born and brought up in the army background. My father was in the army. So I just now, in the last couple of months, we have been hearing that we'll have girls joining the NDA very soon. So how practically possible is it, and how is the army gearing up? Because I have been to NDA a couple of times. I've seen the quarters. I've been to IMA and these other places. So what is your take on it, sir?
Well, the decision has already been taken. So my take is rather belated. But I would like to say, I mean, there is no harm in attempting. We will see if it succeeds. What I am saying is, let us see if it succeeds, good for us. If we find it doesn't succeed, the women themselves will say, we don't find it very healthy, we are too young, we didn't take a right choice. Because once you have joined the NDA, you have taken a call after class 12 to join the armed forces. You are closing all your other options. But later on, the people realize that, I was better suited for the airline industry or for the IT industry, and I have taken a wrong call. That is for the women to decide, because once you join the NDA, you are taking a call to join the armed forces rather early and closing all the options. I remember when we joined the NDA, we joined at class 11. There was no class 12. And we had closed our pre-medical and pre-engineering. That time we used to have pre-medical and pre-engineering examinations to join medical colleges and engineering colleges. We had closed the chapter. A lot of my class fellows are today doctors here in Delhi, engineers, IIT sitting elsewhere. But we had taken the call to join the armed forces. All of the options were closed. You couldn't leave the academy. You left the academy. It was egg on your face. You were very shamed that this guy couldn't live up to the standards. So I'm sure the women will take.
But will the army have to tweak the curriculum?
Gentlemen, I need to close the floor.
Equal. I have always said one thing: equal opportunity means equal responsibility.
Sir, when two army men are looking at you in the way that these two gents are, I need to end. Thank you very much. You've been great, indulgent of all the questions and extremely patient. Thank you very much for coming here once again. Times Now Summit is honored to have you. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been nice interacting with all of you, and I've been as candid as I could be. I still believe my soldiers have human rights and the people have human rights. If human rights have to be fought, they must be fought on an equal footing. Terrorists should also be taken for human rights. And before I close, I would like to give one example. We were given a situation where the NHRC told us that one of the men that your people had picked up in Assam has gone missing. This was against one of my units when I was commanding 3 Corps. And we were told that one of this person has gone missing. And so what happened was that when this chap had gone missing, Human Rights told us that you have to investigate this case. And we were in a quandary as to what do we do. There were calls coming to us. You got to conduct inquiries. People should be blamed. 7 months later, we found this man alive. Now, when we went to the NHRC and told them that what happens to the complainant, he says that we don't investigate. We are only asked to investigate against you. I said, now this is a false complaint. Why should the person who did the complaint about this man having been vanished from us and possibly we've eliminated him has now been traced? Are you not going to go back to that organization, that so-called NGO, which has lodged a complaint against us? It has not been done. So you can't have a one-sided affair. Human rights must deal with both sides of the coin. That's what I thought I should clarify.
General Saab, thank you very much. Candid as always, forthright as always. Thank you very much, sir.